The morning sky threatened rain as Margaret Wilson fumbled with her umbrella, her arthritic fingers struggling with the clasp. At 78, even the simplest tasks had become challenging. She glanced anxiously at her kitchen clock, 8:45 a.m. Her son Derek would arrive in 15 minutes, and he hated waiting. Margaret moved carefully around her small apartment, gathering her essentials for the day. Her medical appointment book, her water bottle, her little pill organizer, and the banana she'd saved for a snack. Each item went methodically into her worn blue canvas bag, a Christmas gift from Derek 3 years ago when he still had patience for such things. She paused at the mirror in her narrow hallway, quickly patting her silver hair. The face that looked back at her seemed like a stranger's sometimes, lined and spotted with age, so different from the energetic woman she remembered being. Margaret sighed and turned away, not wanting to dwell on it. Getting older wasn't for the faint of heart, her late husband Thomas used to say. The apartment buzzer sounded sharply, making her jump. Derek was early today. That could be good or bad depending on his mood. Coming, she called, hurrying as much as her aching hip would allow. She pressed the intercom button. I'll be right down, honey. Fine, came the clipped reply. No good morning, no how are you, just fine. Margaret took a deep breath. Tuesday appointments had become the bright spot in her otherwise lonely week. Not because of the endless medical visits. Goodness knows she'd had enough of doctors poking and prodding and delivering unwelcome news about her aging body. No, Tuesdays were special because Derek would take her to lunch afterward. It wasn't much, usually just the diner across from the medical center. But it was something. A chance to see her only child, to hear about his work, to feel connected to the world outside her four walls. She made one final check of her apartment. Stove off, windows locked, lights off, then made her way carefully down the 3 flights of stairs, gripping the railing tightly. The elevator had been broken for weeks, and the landlord wasn't in any hurry to fix it. Exercise is good for you old folk, he'd said with a dismissive wave when she'd inquired last week. As if navigating those stairs with arthritic knees was some kind of favor he was doing her. Derek was leaning against his car when she emerged from the building, his attention fixed on his phone. He didn't look up until she was nearly beside him. You're early today, Margaret said, trying to sound cheerful. Derek glanced at her, his expression tight. Traffic's going to be bad. We should have left already. He didn't open the car door for her, just unlocked it with a beep and walked around to the driver's side. Margaret settled herself slowly into the passenger seat, trying not to wince as her hip protested. Derek was already starting the engine before she had her seatbelt fastened. How's work going? She asked as they pulled away from the curb. Didn't you have that big presentation yesterday? Derek's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters. You worked so hard on it. Well, apparently not hard enough. His voice had that brittle quality that told her to tread carefully. Tom got the promotion instead. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I don't want to talk about it, Mom. Derek cut her off, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I've got enough stress without rehashing it. Margaret fell silent, her hands folded in her lap. She wanted to reach out, to squeeze his arm like she used to when he was a boy and things went wrong. But the invisible wall between them had grown too solid over the years. She wasn't sure when it had happened. This transformation of her bright, affectionate little boy into this tense, impatient man who seemed to find her presence an imposition. After a few minutes of tense silence, Derek sighed heavily. Look, there's construction on 5th Avenue. We'll never make it through that mess. We'll have to take the bus from here. Margaret's heart sank. The bus meant standing at stops, navigating steps, dealing with crowds, all things that had become increasingly difficult. But she nodded. Whatever you think is best. Derek found a parking spot in a side street and checked his watch repeatedly as they walked to the bus stop. Margaret tried to keep up, but the faster she tried to move, the more unsteady she became. We're going to miss it, Derek muttered, not slowing his pace. I'm doing my best, Margaret said. Her breathing labored. The bus was pulling up just as they reached the stop, and Derek practically pushed her forward. Come on, they won't wait. The first step onto the bus was always the hardest. Margaret gripped the handrail tightly, aware of the impatient sighs behind her as she hoisted herself up. The driver, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, gave her a nod. Take your time, ma'am. She's fine, Derek said shortly, tapping his transit card for both of them. We need to get moving. The bus was crowded, the morning commute still in full swing. Derek spotted 2 seats near the middle and gestured Margaret toward them. She made her way down the aisle carefully, one hand gripping each seat back as she went, conscious of Derek behind her, his impatience radiating like heat. As they settled into their seats, Margaret tried again. "Maybe Mr. Harkins will reconsider. Your quarterly numbers were so good and you've been there longer than Tom." Derek closed his eyes briefly. "Mom, I told you I don't want to discuss it. I just hate to see you upset. That's all." Then stop bringing it up. He pulled out his phone, effectively ending the conversation. Margaret turned to look out the window, watching the city slide by. The buildings here had changed so much over the decades. Where family-owned shops once stood, now chain stores dominated. The old movie theater where Thomas had proposed to her was now a trendy fitness center. Sometimes she hardly recognized the neighborhood where she'd spent most of her life. The bus lurched to a stop, throwing Margaret slightly forward. Her bag slipped from her lap, spilling some of its contents onto the floor. "Oh dear," she murmured, bending to retrieve her items. "Mom, seriously?" Derek's voice carried more loudly than he perhaps intended. Several nearby passengers glanced their way. "Can't you keep track of your stuff for 5 minutes?" Margaret's cheeks burned as she gathered her pill organizer and appointment book. An orange rolled under the seat in front of them. "I'm sorry," she whispered, mortified. The bus stopped suddenly. "Everything's always someone else's fault, isn't it?" Derek reached down impatiently, retrieving the orange with a huff. "Here, and hold on to your bag properly this time." A young woman across the aisle shot Derek a disapproving look, but quickly averted her eyes when he glared back. Margaret clutched her bag tightly to her chest, wishing she could disappear. The bus seemed suddenly too warm, too crowded. She fumbled for her water bottle, her throat dry with embarrassment. "You're not going to spill that too, are you?" Derek asked, eyeing the bottle warily. "No. Of course not." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she took a small sip, then secured the cap tightly. The rest of the journey passed in uncomfortable silence. Margaret watched the streets go by, thinking about how different these Tuesday outings had been when Thomas was still alive. He'd always made her medical appointments feel less frightening, turning them into opportunities for little adventures. "Let's try that new bakery afterward," he'd say. Or, "I heard there's an interesting exhibit at the community center." He'd hold her hand in waiting rooms, make the doctors laugh, insist on ice cream cones on the way home no matter the weather. 5 years he'd been gone now, 5 years of navigating this new, smaller life alone. Derek had stepped in to help with the appointments, but it wasn't the same. Where Thomas had seen these outings as part of life's journey together, Derek clearly viewed them as obligations, burdens to be endured. The bus approached their stop, and Margaret prepared herself for the challenge of disembarking. Standing up was harder than sitting down these days, especially after sitting for a while when her joints stiffened. "This is us," Derek said unnecessarily, already on his feet in the aisle. Margaret gripped the seat in front of her, pushing herself up carefully. The bus was still moving, and she swayed unsteadily. "Can you hurry it up a bit?" Derek said, checking his watch. "Your appointment's in 10 minutes. "I'm trying," Margaret said, her voice small. As she took a step into the aisle, the bus came to another abrupt stop. Margaret lost her balance, stumbling forward. Her water bottle slipped from her bag, the cap coming loose, water splashing across the bus floor and onto Derek's shoes. "For God's sake," Derek exclaimed, jumping back. "This is why I can't take you anywhere. You're such a burden." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and irretrievable. Several passengers looked up, expressions ranging from shock to sympathy. Margaret stood frozen, water soaking into her sensible shoes, her son's frustration laid bare for all to see. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Derek didn't respond, just shook his head and turned toward the door, clearly expecting her to follow. Margaret blinked rapidly, determined not to cry in public. She'd lived through a world war, buried a husband, survived cancer. She wouldn't break down over spilled water and harsh words. But as she followed her son toward the exit, she couldn't help wondering when she'd become a burden rather than a mother. When had Derek's love become obligation? And was there any way back from this moment? This public humiliation, this breaking point between mother and son? She didn't notice the older gentleman in the worn military cap, watching the scene unfold from the back of the bus, his weathered face thoughtful as he observed the interaction between mother and son. She didn't know that in moments this stranger would change everything. The puddle of water spread across the bus floor, soaking into the worn rubber matting. Margaret stood frozen, acutely aware of the eyes on her. Some passengers quickly looked away, pretending they hadn't heard Derek's harsh words. Others watched with open sympathy that somehow made everything worse. "I'm sorry about the mess," Margaret said to the bus driver, her voice barely audible. The driver, a heavy-set man with salt and pepper hair, gave her a kind nod. "Don't you worry about it, ma'am. Happens all the time." Derek stood by the door, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Let's go, Mom. We're holding everyone up." Margaret nodded, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. The water bottle, now empty, was shoved hastily inside. She took a tentative step toward the exit, her wet shoes squeaking slightly on the floor. The first step down from the bus loomed before her like a mountain. "Need a hand, ma'am?" the driver asked, half rising from his seat. "She's fine," Derek answered before Margaret could speak. "She does this every week." Margaret gripped the handrail and lowered herself carefully down the steps one at a time. Her hip protested with each movement, but she bit her lip, determined not to give Derek more reason for frustration. As her feet finally touched the sidewalk, she released a small breath of relief. Derek was already walking ahead toward the medical building, his back rigid with tension. Margaret hurried after him as best she could, the gap between them widening with each step. The morning clouds had thickened and a light drizzle began to fall. Margaret fumbled in her bag for her umbrella, but by the time she managed to open it, her hair and shoulders were already damp. "Derek," she called, her voice nearly lost in the city noise. "Derek, please slow down a bit." He either didn't hear or chose to ignore her. Margaret watched him disappear through the revolving doors of the medical center, leaving her to make her way alone through the rain. A familiar heaviness settled in her chest, not the physical discomfort her doctor was always concerned about, but something deeper and more painful. When had things changed so drastically between them? Derek had been such a sweet boy, serious and sometimes shy but affectionate. She remembered how he'd climb into her lap well past the age when most children stop seeking such comfort, how he'd bring her wildflowers picked from the park, how he'd proudly show her his schoolwork. "Look, Mom," he'd say, eyes bright with accomplishment. "I did good, right?" Now he could barely look at her. Now she was just another problem in his already complicated life. By the time Margaret reached the revolving doors, she was out of breath. She paused, leaning against the building's stone facade, gathering her strength. The medical center was always too cold and her damp clothes would make it worse. She should have worn her heavier sweater. Inside, Derek stood at the check-in desk, tapping his foot impatiently. When he spotted her, he made a show of looking at his watch. "There you are. I've already checked you in." "They're running behind as usual." "Thank you," Margaret said, closing her umbrella and shaking off the excess water. "I appreciate you doing that." Derek didn't acknowledge her gratitude. "I have some work calls to make. Can you manage on your own for a bit?" Before she could answer, he was already walking toward the exit, phone in hand. "Text me when you're done. I'll be outside." Margaret watched him go, then made her way to the waiting area. The plastic chairs were uncomfortable, designed for people with younger bodies and stronger backs. She chose one near a heating vent and settled in for what would likely be a long wait. Around her, other patients waited, some scrolling through phones, others leafing through dog-eared magazines. An elderly man with a cane sat directly across from her, his gaze catching hers briefly before returning to the newspaper in his lap. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar, but Margaret couldn't place him. She reached into her bag for her appointment book, wanting to double-check the time for her follow-up next week. As she did, her pill organizer slipped out and clattered to the floor, small white tablets scattering across the tile. "Oh no," she whispered, dismayed. Her heart medication, her arthritis pills, her calcium supplements, all mixed together on the dirty floor. She began to bend down, but her body refused to cooperate, hip and knees protesting sharply. "Allow me," said a deep voice. The man with the newspaper was suddenly kneeling beside her chair, carefully gathering the fallen pills. Up close, she could see he wore a faded military cap with pins on it, his dark brown skin lined with age, eyes clear and kind beneath gray brows. "Thank you so much," Margaret said, deeply grateful. "I'm so clumsy these days." "Not clumsy," the man corrected gently. "Just dealing with a body that sometimes has its own ideas." He finished collecting the pills and handed them to her. Though I'm afraid these are all mixed up now. Will that be a problem? Margaret sighed. I'll sort them out later. I know which is which by their shape. He nodded, seeming to understand completely. I'm James Porter, he said, offering his hand. Margaret Wilson, she replied, taking it. His grip was firm but gentle, the hand itself rough with calluses. Have we met before? You look familiar. A slight smile crossed his face. We were on the same bus just now. Margaret's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as the memory flooded back. The spilled water, Derek's harsh words, the pitying looks. Oh, you saw that. I did. James settled back into his seat across from her. Your son seems to be having a rough day. She wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her wanted to defend Derek, to explain that he wasn't always like this, that he had pressures and stresses she couldn't understand. Another part, a part she usually kept buried deep, wanted to cry, to admit how lonely and hurtful these Tuesday appointments had become. He lost out on a promotion yesterday, she said finally. He works so hard. It's made him a bit short-tempered. James nodded thoughtfully. Life has a way of piling on, doesn't it? Still, there are some burdens we choose to carry and others we don't. Before Margaret could ask what he meant, a nurse appeared at the doorway. Mrs. Wilson? The doctor will see you now. Margaret gathered her things, nodding a goodbye to James. As she followed the nurse down the hallway, she couldn't help but wonder about the quiet dignity in the old veteran's eyes, the gentle way he'd helped her without making her feel helpless. The examination room was chilly, just as she'd expected. Dr. Hayes was running even later than usual, leaving Margaret sitting on the paper-covered table for nearly 20 minutes before he bustled in, already apologizing. Mrs. Wilson, so sorry for the delay. It's been one of those mornings. How are you feeling? About the same, Margaret answered honestly. Good days and bad days. The doctor nodded, already checking her blood pressure. And the new medication? Any side effects? A bit of dizziness sometimes. Nothing too bad. The examination proceeded as it always did. Questions about pain levels, flexibility tests, discussions about medication adjustments. Through it all, Margaret's mind kept drifting back to the bus, to Derek's face twisted with impatience, to the shame that had washed over her as other passengers witnessed her humiliation. Your blood pressure's a bit elevated today, Dr. Hayes noted, making a note in her chart. I had a stressful morning, Margaret admitted. The doctor looked up, his expression softening slightly. Everything all right at home? You're still managing on your own? Yes, of course, she said quickly, not wanting to open that particular door. Just public transportation troubles. Nothing serious. Dr. Hayes didn't seem entirely convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Well, I'd like to adjust your medication slightly. And let's schedule an echocardiogram for next month, just to be safe. By the time Margaret left the examination room, clutching a new prescription and appointment card, nearly an hour had passed. She made her way slowly back to the waiting area, expecting to find it empty. To her surprise, James Porter still sat there, though he now had a small paper cup of water in his hand instead of a newspaper. Everything go all right? He asked as she approached. Just the usual, Margaret replied, suddenly shy. Are you still waiting to be seen? James shook his head. My appointment's not for another hour. I always come early. He gestured to the chair beside him. Care to sit for a spell? Hospitals always leave me feeling like I could use a friendly chat afterward. Margaret hesitated only briefly before settling into the offered chair. There was something comforting about this stranger, something that put her at ease in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Were you in Vietnam? She asked, nodding toward his cap with its pins and insignia. Yes, ma'am. 2 tours. He touched the brim of the cap lightly, almost reverently. Seems like another lifetime now. My husband Thomas was there too. Army. Marines, James said, a note of pride in his voice. Your husband made it back okay? Margaret nodded. Yes, though he never talked much about it. Not until near the end anyway. That's how it goes sometimes. We carry it quiet for decades, then suddenly need to set it down before we go. James studied her face. He's passed, then? 5 years ago. Heart attack. Even now the words caught slightly in her throat. It was quick, at least. James nodded solemnly. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Wilson. Margaret, please. Margaret. He smiled, lines crinkling around his eyes. So it's just you and your son now? The question touched a tender spot. Yes, Derek's my only child. He's got a lot on his plate. Work stress, a mortgage. He helps when he can. Something in James's expression told her he'd seen right through her polite fiction, had witnessed the truth of their relationship on that bus, but he didn't challenge her. Children carry their own burdens, he said instead. Sometimes they forget that we carried them first. The simple truth of it, spoken without judgment or pity, brought unexpected tears to Margaret's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, not wanting to embarrass herself twice in one day. I should text Derek, she said, fumbling for her phone. He's waiting outside. James checked his watch. Before you do, would you like to get a cup of tea in the cafeteria? My treat. Might warm you up after getting caught in that rain. Margaret hesitated, knowing Derek would be impatient, possibly angry at any further delay, but something in her rebelled at the thought of rushing back to his disapproval, of cutting short this unexpected moment of kindness. I'd like that, she said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. Very much. As they walked slowly toward the cafeteria, Margaret found herself wondering what Derek would make of James Porter, this dignified veteran who'd shown more consideration to a stranger in 10 minutes than her own son, had shown his mother in months, and somewhere deep inside, a small spark of something long dormant began to glow. Not quite hope, but perhaps its quiet precursor, a reminder that not all human connections were fraying, that kindness could still appear in unexpected places. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with quiet conversation, the scent of coffee and institutional food hanging in the air. Margaret sat across from James at a small table near the window, warming her hands around a paper cup of tea. Outside, the drizzle had turned into a steady rain, drops racing down the glass like tiny rivers. You take sugar? James asked, pushing a small container of packets toward her. Just one, thank you. Margaret tore open the pink packet carefully, tipping the contents into her cup. The simple act of having tea with a new acquaintance felt strangely momentous, as if she were breaking some unwritten rule. Her phone buzzed in her purse, likely Derek wondering where she was. For once, she let it go unanswered. 5 more minutes of peace wouldn't hurt anyone. So, James said, stirring his own cup of black coffee. You come here every Tuesday? Margaret nodded. For the past year or so, heart checkups, arthritis treatments, the usual old age troubles. She smiled ruefully. The doctors keep me busy. Tell me about it, James chuckled. Between the VA and regular doctors, I could make a part-time job out of medical appointments. The VA? Margaret asked. Do they take good care of you? A shadow crossed James's face briefly. Better now than they used to. Took decades for them to acknowledge some of our problems. Agent Orange exposure, PTSD. But I can't complain too much. I'm still here. He tapped his fingers against the table, a restless gesture at odds with his otherwise calm demeanor. Many aren't. Margaret thought of Thomas, how he'd wake sometimes in the night, shaking, unable to tell her what nightmares had gripped him. How he'd been exposed to some chemicals that the military insisted were harmless until years later, they weren't. My Thomas had trouble getting help too, she said quietly. He always said the system wasn't built for actually helping veterans, just for processing them. James nodded, a flash of recognition in his eyes. Your husband sounds like a wise man. He was. Margaret took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest. What about you? Do you have family nearby? My wife Rose passed 6 years ago. Cancer. James's voice softened around the name. We had 2 daughters. One's in California, a professor at Berkeley. The other's closer, about an hour north of the city. 3 grandkids between them. You must be proud. Every day. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. Rose did the hard work, raising them mostly on her own while I was deployed. Then working double shifts when I came back, different. He paused, seeming to consider how much to share. It took me a long time to find my feet again, to be the kind of father and husband they deserved. Margaret nodded, understanding in her silence. Thomas had struggled too, though in different ways. Quieter ways. What about your son? James asked. Has he always lived in the city? The question brought Margaret back to her current reality. Derek waiting outside, probably furious by now, her phone still buzzing occasionally in her purse. Yes, he never wanted to leave. Got a job in finance right out of college. She hesitated, feeling suddenly protective of Derek despite everything. He's under a lot of pressure. His company's been downsizing and he works such long hours. James studied her face, his expression thoughtful. Pressure changes people, reveals things that might otherwise stay hidden. He set down his coffee cup, but it's no excuse for treating someone like they're worthless. Especially not your mother. The directness caught Margaret off guard. Most people would have politely ignored what they'd witnessed on the bus or offered vague platitudes. James had cut straight to the heart of it. He doesn't mean it, she said automatically, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. He's just going through a difficult time. Maybe so, James conceded. But difficult times come to all of us. It's how we handle them that shows who we really are. Margaret looked down at her tea, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to defend Derek, to explain that he hadn't always been this way. Another part recognized the truth in James's words, a truth she'd been avoiding for too long. I worry sometimes, she admitted quietly, that I've become nothing but a burden to him, that he resents these Tuesdays. Have you asked him? Margaret shook her head. I'm afraid of the answer. The honesty of her own response surprised her. She'd never spoken these fears aloud, not even to her closest friends. James reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers briefly. The gesture was comforting, respectful, the touch of someone who understood loss and loneliness. Fear keeps us stuck, he said gently. Keeps us accepting less than we deserve. Before Margaret could respond, her phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. With a sigh, she pulled it from her purse. 3 missed calls and a text message from Derek. Where are you? I've been waiting 20 minutes. I should go, she said, gathering her things. My son's waiting. James nodded, standing as she did. I'll walk you out. They made their way slowly through the hospital corridors, matching their pace to Margaret's careful steps. The easy silence between them felt comfortable, as if they'd known each other for years rather than hours. As they approached the main entrance, Margaret could see Derek through the glass doors, pacing back and forth under the covered walkway, phone pressed to his ear. His face was tight with irritation. That's my son, she said unnecessarily. James followed her gaze. I remember him from the bus. His tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Margaret felt suddenly nervous, caught between these two men from different parts of her life. Thank you for the tea, James. It was very kind of you. My pleasure, Margaret. He paused, seeming to consider something. Would it be all right if I spoke to your son for a moment? Alarm flashed through her. Oh, I don't think... Nothing confrontational, James assured her. Just man to man, Margaret hesitated. Derek would be angry enough about the delay. Being approached by a stranger might push him over the edge, but something in James's steady gaze made her nod slowly. All right, she agreed. But please, he's had a difficult day. Together, they pushed through the doors into the damp afternoon air. Derek spotted them immediately, his expression darkening as he ended his call and strode toward them. Mom, where have you been? I've been calling for 20 minutes. His voice carried across the walkway, drawing glances from others coming and going. I'm sorry, dear, Margaret began. I got talking with... And who's this? Derek cut her off, eyeing James suspiciously. James Porter, the older man said, extending his hand. I met your mother in the waiting room. Derek ignored the outstretched hand. Well, we need to go. Our lunch reservation was for noon and we've already missed it. You go to lunch after her appointments? James asked, his tone conversational. That's a nice tradition. When we can make it on time, yes, Derek said pointedly, checking his watch again. Son, James said, the word gentle but firm. May I have a word with you? Just a moment. Derek looked taken aback. Excuse me? Please, Derek, Margaret said quietly. Just a minute. Something in her voice, perhaps the unusual assertiveness, made Derek pause. He glanced between them, then sighed in exasperation. Fine. 1 minute. He stepped a few paces away from Margaret, clearly expecting James to follow. James touched Margaret's arm lightly. Why don't you wait inside out of the rain? This won't take long. Margaret nodded, retreating to just inside the doors where she could still see them but not hear their conversation. Through the glass, she watched as James spoke, his manner calm and steady. Derek's posture was stiff at first, defensive. Then something shifted, a slight drop of his shoulders, a tilt of his head as he actually seemed to listen. What could this stranger possibly be saying to her son? What words could penetrate the wall of frustration and impatience Derek had built around himself? The conversation lasted longer than the promised minute. 3 minutes, perhaps 5. Margaret couldn't hear their words, but she could see Derek's expression changing, his face softening slightly. At one point, James placed a hand on Derek's shoulder, not forcefully, but with the natural authority of someone who had seen more of life, who carried wisdom earned through hardship. Finally, James extended his hand again. This time, Derek took it, shaking it firmly. The two men turned toward the entrance, and Margaret quickly moved back, not wanting to be caught watching. The doors opened, bringing with them a gust of damp air and the sounds of traffic. Derek's face was thoughtful, his earlier anger seemingly dissolved. "Ready for lunch, Mom?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been all day. Margaret blinked in surprise. "I thought we'd missed our reservation." "We'll find somewhere else," Derek said. He turned to James. "Thank you, sir, for your service and for your words." James nodded, the gesture containing layers of unspoken understanding between the men. "It was an honor to meet you both." He looked at Margaret. "Perhaps I'll see you next Tuesday?" "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with her certainty. As Derek guided her toward the exit, his hand lightly at her elbow, not pushing, just supporting, Margaret glanced back at James. He stood watching them go, a quiet sentinel in his faded military cap, a man who'd stepped into a stranger's life and changed its course with nothing but honest words and hard-earned wisdom. "What did he say to you?" Margaret asked as they walked toward the parking garage. Derek was quiet for a moment, helping her navigate a puddle on the sidewalk. "He reminded me of some things I should have remembered on my own." "Like what?" Derek stopped walking, turning to face her fully for what felt like the first time in years. "Like the fact that you carried me before I could walk, that you stayed up nights when I was sick, that you worked 2 jobs after Dad's business failed so I could stay in the same school with my friends." His voice grew husky. "That everything I am, everything I have, started with you believing in me." Margaret's heart swelled with emotion, tears threatening to spill over. "James said all that?" "Not in those exact words." Derek shook his head slightly. "He told me about his mother, actually. How she raised him alone after his father was killed in action. How she worked herself to exhaustion to keep a roof over their heads. How he was too young, too self-absorbed to appreciate it then." "What happened to her?" Margaret asked softly. "She died while he was overseas. He never got to thank her, never got to make things right." Derek swallowed hard. "He told me not to make the same mistake." They stood there in the light rain, the sounds of the city continuing around them, a mother and son at a crossroads. Margaret could see the boy she'd raised in the man before her, the sensitivity he'd buried beneath layers of adult concerns, the goodness that pressure and stress had temporarily obscured. "I'm sorry, Mom," Derek said, the words simple but profound. "For the bus. For everything today. You're not a burden. You've never been a burden." Margaret reached up, touching his cheek gently the way she used to when he was small. "We all have bad days, sweetheart." "But that's no excuse." He covered her hand with his own. "James said something else, too. He said that how we treat others during our worst moments reveals more about us than how we act during our best." Margaret thought of James, of the quiet dignity he carried, of the storms he must have weathered to gain such wisdom. "He sounds like a remarkable man," she said. "He is." Derek offered his arm. "Now, how about that lunch? Anywhere you'd like to go." As they walked arm in arm toward the street, Margaret felt something shift between them. Not a complete transformation, but a beginning. A chance to rebuild what had been crumbling. All because a stranger on a bus had the courage to speak truth with kindness, to stand up for an old woman's dignity. Sometimes, she reflected, angels appeared in the most unexpected forms, not with wings and halos, but with weathered faces and faded military caps, carrying the hard-won wisdom that only comes from living through pain and emerging on the other side, heart still intact. The small Italian restaurant was warm and inviting, the kind of family-owned place that had become increasingly rare in the neighborhood. Red-checkered tablecloths, soft accordion music playing through hidden speakers, and the rich aroma of garlic and tomato sauce created an atmosphere that felt like stepping into another time. Margaret settled into her chair as Derek held it for her, a small courtesy he hadn't offered in months. The waiter brought them water and menus, his friendly smile suggesting this was a place where people were valued, not just processed. "This is lovely," Margaret said, looking around. "How did you find it?" "A colleague mentioned it," Derek replied, studying his menu. Said it was the best lasagna in the city. He glanced up. I thought you might like it. Reminds me a little of that place Dad used to take us to when I was a kid. Margaret's heart warmed at the memory. Vincenzo's. You always ordered spaghetti and meatballs, even after you were old enough to try something new. Some things you don't mess with, Derek said with a small smile, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. They ordered lasagna for Derek, eggplant parmesan for Margaret, and settled into a silence that felt less strained than their earlier interactions. Margaret could sense Derek struggling with something, his fingers tapping lightly on the water glass, his gaze occasionally drifting to the window and back. So, he said finally, do you know that man well, James? Margaret shook her head. We just met today after. She hesitated. After what happened on the bus, Derek winced slightly. Right. He was kind to me in the waiting room, Margaret continued. We got to talking about his time in Vietnam, his family. She paused. He lost his wife to cancer a few years ago. He mentioned that, Derek said quietly. He took a sip of water, his expression thoughtful. He seems like a good man. I think he is. Margaret smoothed her napkin on her lap, a nervous habit. What did he say to you exactly? If you don't mind telling me. Derek was quiet for a moment as if arranging his thoughts. He told me about coming home from Vietnam. How hard it was to adjust, how he'd snap at his wife, his kids, how the smallest things would set him off. He looked down at his hands. He said he was lucky. His wife called him on it. Wouldn't let him use the war as an excuse to treat people badly. That takes courage, Margaret observed. It does. Derek met her eyes. He told me something else, too. He said he volunteers at the VA hospital now, driving older vets to their appointments. Said it was his way of honoring the guys who never made it back and making sure those who did don't get forgotten. The waiter arrived with their food, momentarily pausing their conversation. Steam rose from the generously portioned plates, the scent of herbs and cheese filling the air between them. This looks wonderful, Margaret said, picking up her fork. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the food providing a welcome distraction from the emotional weight of the day. Margaret noticed that Derek seemed less rushed than usual, actually savoring his meal rather than eating mechanically while checking emails on his phone. Mom, he said eventually, setting down his fork. I need to apologize properly, not just for today, but for a lot of things. Margaret felt her throat tighten. You don't have to. I do, Derek interrupted gently. James was right. I've been using stress as an excuse. The truth is I've been taking you for granted. He took a deep breath. More than that. I've been treating these Tuesday appointments like they're some huge inconvenience when really what? Margaret prompted when he trailed off. When really they should be something I cherish. His voice grew softer. Time with you isn't a burden. It's a gift. One that won't be around forever. Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with her own. Oh, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere just yet. But that's just it, isn't it? Derek's eyes shone with emotion. None of us knows how much time we have. James made me see that. He said his biggest regret was all the time he wasted. The birthdays he missed when his kids were young. The anniversaries he spent arguing with his wife over nothing that mattered. Margaret thought of Thomas, of all the small moments they'd shared that had seemed ordinary at the time but now glowed in her memory like jewels. The Sunday morning coffees on their tiny balcony. The way he'd always warm her side of the bed in winter, the proud look on his face when Derek graduated college. Your father used to say that time was the only true currency, she said. That how we spend it shows what we really value. Derek nodded, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. I haven't been spending mine very wisely lately. We all get lost sometimes, Margaret said. The important thing is finding our way back. Their conversation shifted then, moving away from the heaviness of apologies into something lighter yet somehow deeper. Derek asked about her friends from the senior center, actually listening to her answers. She inquired about his projects at work, offering perspectives that made him pause and consider. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward pauses, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall that had grown between mother and son, letting light filter through. After they finished their meal, Derek insisted on dessert, tiramisu to share, with 2 forks. Remember how Dad would never order dessert, Derek said, smiling at the memory, but would always eat half of yours. Margaret laughed. He claimed it didn't count as calories if it was from someone else's plate. He had a lot of theories like that. That he did. Margaret's voice softened with fondness. He would have liked James, I think. Because they were both veterans. Partly that, but mostly because they share the same kind of integrity, I suppose you'd call it. She took a small bite of the tiramisu, a strong sense of what's right and the courage to stand up for it. Derek nodded thoughtfully. I was angry at first, you know. When he asked to speak to me, I thought, who is this stranger to tell me how to treat my own mother? What changed your mind? The way he spoke. Not judgmental or preachy, just real. Derek traced patterns in the condensation on his water glass. He told me he'd made every mistake a man could make. That he'd hurt people he loved because he was too proud to admit when he was wrong. He looked up at Margaret. He said wisdom is usually earned the hard way, and he was trying to save me some pain. Margaret thought about the lines on James's face, the quiet dignity in his bearing. What battles had he fought, both in war and after, to gain the wisdom he now shared so generously? Will you see him again? Derek asked, surprising her. I might. He mentioned being at the hospital next Tuesday. She studied her son's face. Would that bother you? Derek shook his head. No, actually, I'd like to thank him properly. He hesitated. Maybe I could come inside with you next week, instead of just dropping you off. If that's okay? The simple offer to accompany her fully, to be present rather than merely fulfilling an obligation, touched Margaret deeply. I'd like that very much, she said. After paying the bill, they stepped outside to find that the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, casting the wet streets in a golden glow. Derek offered his arm as they walked toward the parking garage, matching his pace to hers without complaint. As they drove home, Margaret noticed small changes in her son. The tension that usually radiated from him had eased. His knuckles no longer white on the steering wheel. When they stopped at a red light, he didn't immediately reach for his phone to check emails. Instead, he asked if she wanted to listen to music, tuning the radio to the classical station she loved. Pulling up in front of her apartment building, Derek turned off the engine. I'll walk you up. You don't have to, Margaret said automatically. I know you have to get back to work. It can wait, Derek said, coming around to open her door. Besides, I should check that leaky faucet you mentioned last week. The surprise must have shown on her face because Derek added, I've been meaning to get to it. Just got distracted. They climbed the stairs together slowly, Derek carrying her bag. On the second-floor landing, Margaret needed to pause and catch her breath. Instead of the impatient fidgeting she'd grown accustomed to, Derek simply waited, commenting on the building's faded wallpaper, reminiscing about the elaborate hide-and-seek games he used to play in these hallways as a child, when visiting his grandmother, who had lived in the same building decades ago. Inside her apartment, Derek went straight to the kitchen to examine the dripping faucet while Margaret put away her medical papers and hung up her coat. I think I can fix this today, he called out. Do you still keep tools in the hall closet? Bottom shelf in your father's old red toolbox, she replied, warmed by his remembered knowledge of her home. As Derek worked on the faucet, Margaret made tea, the familiar domestic rhythm soothing after the emotional turbulence of the day. The sunlight streamed through her small kitchen window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, casting a warm glow over the worn but well-loved space. There, Derek said eventually, turning the tap to demonstrate the absence of drips. Good as new. Thank you, dear, Margaret said, handing him a cup of tea. You didn't have to do that today. I wanted to. He accepted the cup, leaning against the counter. Actually, I've been thinking, what if I came by on Sunday? I could help with some of the other repairs around here. Maybe change those light bulbs in the hall that you can't reach. Margaret tried to hide her surprise and delight. That would be wonderful. But are you sure? Sundays are your only day off. All the more reason to spend it doing something worthwhile. He glanced around the apartment. Maybe we could even go through some of those photo albums you've been wanting to organize. I'd like to hear the stories behind some of those old pictures. The suggestion, so simple yet so meaningful, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. How long had it been since Derek had shown interest in family history, in the memories she cherished? I'd like that very much, she said. her voice slightly unsteady. As Derek prepared to leave, promising to call her that evening to check in, Margaret found herself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that shaped a life. How a spilled water bottle on a crowded bus had led to public humiliation, which had brought a kind stranger into their lives, which had somehow begun to heal a relationship she'd feared was broken beyond repair. Standing at her window, watching Derek walk to his car, Margaret sent a silent thank you to James Porter, the man in the faded military cap who had seen an injustice and decided, simply and without fanfare, to do something about it. One act of courage, one moment of standing up for what was right. And like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples spread outward, changing everything they touched. 3 months later, the summer heat had given way to crisp autumn air. Leaves in golden and russet hues drifted from the trees lining the street outside Margaret's apartment building. She stood at her window watching the world go by as she waited for Derek to arrive. So much had changed since that Tuesday in the rain. True to his word, Derek had come by that Sunday to fix things around her apartment. He'd arrived with bagels and cream cheese, and they'd spent the afternoon going through old photo albums. Margaret had shared stories of his father's youthful adventures, of grandparents Derek barely remembered, of her own childhood during wartime. "I never knew Dad played baseball in college," Derek had said, examining a faded photograph of Thomas in uniform. Young and confident, his future stretching before him. "Oh yes, he was quite good," Margaret had replied. "He had a chance to play minor league, but then the draft came." It was the first of many Sundays. Each week, Derek would arrive, sometimes with groceries or small gifts. A plant for her windowsill, a novel by her favorite author, a soft new sweater as the weather turned cooler. They'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm, these Sunday visits becoming something they both looked forward to rather than an obligation to be endured. And Tuesdays had transformed as well. Derek no longer waited impatiently in the car during her appointments. Instead, he came inside, sat with her, actually engaged with her doctors about her care, and each week they looked for James. They'd found him that first Tuesday after the incident, sitting in his usual spot in the waiting room, newspaper in hand. Derek had approached him somewhat awkwardly, extending his hand. "Mr. Porter, I wanted to thank you properly for last week." James had smiled, those wise eyes crinkling at the corners. "No thanks needed, son. How's your week been?" Somehow that simple question had opened the door to a friendship none of them had expected. They'd begun having lunch together after Margaret's appointments, sometimes at the hospital cafeteria, sometimes at nearby restaurants. James shared stories of his time in Vietnam, of raising daughters as a sometimes absent father, of finding his way back to himself after the war. "The hardest battle I ever fought wasn't in the jungle," he'd told them one afternoon over sandwiches. "It was right here, coming home, trying to be the man my family needed when I barely recognized myself anymore." Derek had listened with newfound respect, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own struggles. The pressure at work, the fear of failure, the sense that life was slipping by while he chased goals that never seemed to bring satisfaction. Now, watching from her window, Margaret spotted Derek's car pulling up to the curb. Today wasn't Tuesday or Sunday, their usual meeting days. Today was special. Margaret checked her appearance one last time in the hallway mirror, smoothing the collar of her new blouse, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, Derek had said when he'd given it to her last week. The doorbell rang, and Margaret opened it to find not just Derek but James as well, both men smiling broadly. "Ready for your big day?" Derek asked, bending to kiss her cheek. "As ready as I'll ever be," Margaret replied, trying to hide her nervousness. "You look lovely," James said, his voice warm with genuine appreciation. "Thank you, James." Margaret felt a blush rise to her cheeks. At 78, she'd thought herself well past such youthful reactions. But James had a way of making her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced since Thomas passed. Together they made their way carefully down the stairs and out to Derek's car. Derek had insisted on driving, though the community center was only a few blocks away. "No sense in tiring yourself before the big event," he'd said. The past months had revealed a thoughtfulness in her son that had been buried beneath stress and impatience. Small considerations, remembering her preference for the passenger seat to be moved forward, bringing her water before she asked, Noticing when she was tired and suggesting they continue another day, these tiny kindnesses had rebuilt her faith in the boy she'd raised. "Nervous?" James asked from the back seat, leaning forward slightly. "A little," Margaret admitted. "It's been so long since I've done anything like this." "You'll be wonderful," Derek assured her, navigating through the weekend traffic. "You've been practicing for weeks." The community center parking lot was nearly full when they arrived. Derek found a spot close to the entrance and came around to help Margaret out of the car. James walked beside them, steady and supportive, as they made their way inside. The main hall had been transformed with autumn decorations, gourds and colored leaves arranged on tables covered with orange cloths, strings of tiny lights casting a warm glow. A small stage had been set up at one end where a piano waited, its polished surface gleaming under the lights. "Mrs. Wilson, you're here!" The center's activities director, a cheerful woman with gray-streaked hair, hurried over to greet them. "We've got you scheduled third in the program. Is that still all right?" "Perfect," Margaret replied. "Not too early, not too late." "And you must be Margaret's son," the director said, turning to Derek. "She's told us so much about you. All good things, I hope," Derek said with a smile. "The very best." The director glanced at James questioningly. "This is my friend, James Porter," Margaret explained. "He's been kind enough to support me in this adventure." "Wonderful. The more the merrier. We've reserved seats in the front row for family and friends." As the director hurried off to greet other arrivals, Derek touched his mother's arm. "I'm going to get us some refreshments." "Coffee for everyone?" "Tea for me, please," Margaret said. "I'll get nervous enough without caffeine." When Derek had gone, James guided Margaret to a quiet corner where she could observe the growing crowd without being overwhelmed. "How are you really feeling?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. "What was I thinking, agreeing to this?" "You were thinking that life is too short not to take chances," James said gently. "That the things that scare us are often the ones most worth doing." Margaret smiled, recognizing her own words from a conversation weeks ago. They'd been having lunch after one of her appointments when the director had approached their table, eager to recruit participants for the center's talent showcase. "We need more performers," she'd explained, "especially folks with classical training. Mrs. Wilson, I've heard you were quite the pianist in your day." Margaret had demurred, explaining that arthritis had stiffened her fingers, that she hadn't played seriously in years. But the seed had been planted. That evening, she'd opened the piano bench in her living room, pulling out sheet music untouched since Thomas's passing. The next Sunday, Derek had found her trying simple scales, wincing at the stiffness in her joints. "You're playing again?" he'd asked, surprised. "Trying to," she'd replied. "These old hands don't cooperate like they used to." Instead of the dismissive response she might have expected months ago, Derek had sat beside her on the bench. "I remember you playing when I was little. You'd let me turn the pages for you even though I usually got it wrong." That memory, the simple joy of sharing music with her son, had prompted Margaret to call the director and volunteer for the showcase, despite her fears. Now as she watched people filing into the community center hall, Margaret felt a curious mixture of anxiety and anticipation. At her age, she'd thought certain chapters of her life were firmly closed. Yet here she was, about to perform in public for the first time in decades. "Here we go," Derek said, returning with their drinks. "They're almost ready to start." The program began with a young girl performing a spirited violin piece, followed by an elderly gentleman reciting poetry he'd written for his late wife. Then the director was announcing Margaret's name and Derek was squeezing her hand, and James was whispering, "Show them what you've got, Margaret." The walk to the piano seemed both eternal and too quick. Margaret settled onto the bench, adjusting it slightly, placing her hands on the keys. She'd chosen Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece challenging enough to show her skill but familiar enough to play despite her arthritis. As her fingers struck the first delicate notes, she glanced up to see Derek and James watching, their faces filled with pride and encouragement. The music flowed from her hands, not perfect but heartfelt. Each note carried memories of playing this same piece for Thomas when they were young, of teaching little Derek to appreciate music beyond what played on the radio, of quiet evenings alone after Thomas died when the piano remained closed, too painful a reminder of happier times. As the final notes faded into silence, Margaret released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then came the applause, warm, generous, led by Derek, who had risen to his feet, clapping enthusiastically. James stood beside him, his weathered face alight with admiration. The rest of the showcase passed in a pleasant blur. Afterward, as people mingled and congratulated the performers, Derek brought over an elderly couple who lived in Margaret's building. "They came especially to hear you play, Mom," he explained. "I invited some of your neighbors." This thoughtful gesture, remembering that she'd mentioned missing connections with people in her building, touched Margaret deeply. As she chatted with her neighbors, she noticed James speaking with the community center director. Their conversation animated. When the crowd finally began to thin, Derek, Margaret, and James made their way to a nearby diner for a celebratory dinner. The familiar red vinyl booths and checkerboard floor tiles welcomed them like old friends. "To the pianist extraordinaire," Derek said, raising his water glass in a toast. "Mom, you were amazing." "I fumbled that middle section terribly," Margaret protested, but she was smiling. "Sounded perfect to me," James said. "And I've heard a lot of piano in my day." As they enjoyed their meal, James seemed thoughtful, occasionally glancing at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I have a proposition," he said finally. "That director at the community center, Beverly, she mentioned they're looking for someone to teach basic piano to seniors. Just once a week, very informal." Margaret set down her fork. "And you suggested me?" James nodded. "I hope that wasn't overstepping. It just seemed like such a natural fit, the way your face lit up when you were playing." Derek leaned forward. "That's a fantastic idea. Mom, you'd be perfect for that." "I don't know," Margaret said hesitantly. "Teaching requires patience, and my arthritis—" "You taught third grade for 20 years, Derek reminded her. "If that's not patience, I don't know what is. And as for the arthritis, you just showed everyone that it doesn't stop you from playing beautifully." Margaret looked between the two men, her son and this friend, who had become so important to both of them in such a short time. Their faith in her was palpable, warming her from the inside. "I'll think about it," she promised. Later, as Derek drove them home through streets gilded by the setting sun, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful journey that had brought them here. From that horrible moment on the bus, her humiliation, Derek's cruelty, to this day of music and celebration, one intervention by a courageous stranger had created ripples that continued to transform their lives. "James," she said suddenly, "would you like to come up for coffee? I made apple cake yesterday." "I'd be honored," James replied from the back seat. "If Derek can join us?" "Actually," Derek said, "I need to head out soon. I promised to review some files before tomorrow." He caught his mother's eye. "But I'll be by on Sunday as usual. We can finish organizing Dad's records if you want." "That would be lovely," Margaret said, noting the difference in how Derek now mentioned work obligations, not as an escape but simply as a fact, with the clear understanding that their time together remained a priority. As they pulled up to Margaret's building, the evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Derek helped his mother from the car, then gave her a warm hug. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," he whispered. Dad would have been too. Tears pricked at Margaret's eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart." Derek turned to James, extending his hand. "Thanks for coming today. It meant a lot to Mom." "Wouldn't have missed it," James replied, shaking Derek's hand firmly. "See you Tuesday?" "Absolutely." Derek smiled, the genuine smile that had once been rare but now came easily. "Take good care of my mom tonight." As Derek drove away, Margaret and James walked slowly toward the building entrance, their pace unhurried, comfortable in each other's company. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "when I spoke up on that bus, I never imagined where it would lead." Margaret slipped her arm through his. "Sometimes the smallest actions,